Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Sunday, September 7th, 2025. The time is 8:45 p.m. and I am in Pinecrest, Florida. The topic of this lecture is Emmanuel Isaiah Smith's State of the Union address. I am going to give you in this lecture my own interpretation of the State of the Union. The Union being the United States of America. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, as always, I do these lectures outdoors, and there is background noise. So from time to time, I may have to raise or project my voice to drown out the background noise and communicate more effectively. The State of the Union of the United States of America is this. You have various factions, groups, and organizations that seek to enrich themselves at the expense of others. You have various factions and groups that seek to enrich themselves by helping others. And you essentially have the majority of the population looking to live day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, as comfortably as they possibly can. Not only for them, but also for their significant others, whoever they may be. Now, gang-stalking is ultimately an enterprise. Gang-stalking is a revenue-generating business. It's not incorporated like, for example, a retail store like Lowe's or Sears or Home Depot or Target. It's not necessarily a service provider either, like a private hospital or a private school or a private college or university, or a company that provides corporate landscaping services, or a telecommunications provider. All of these types of companies offer a service to the community, to the people, to the public. Gang-stalking is just as much of a business as is any of the companies I've just named, and it is as much of an enterprise or an industry as any of the service providers that I just named. Gang-stalking generates revenues for the military-industrial complex, which is the corporate mechanism that manufactures, produces, and sells military-grade technology to governments, businesses, and people. Gang-stalking is a very sophisticated tracking, surveillance, and disruption mechanism. And in order to successfully track, surveil, and disrupt a United States citizen who is generally free to move about as he pleases, you need to have quite a bit of military-grade industrial technology, military-grade stratagem, and military-grade personnel mobilization tactics to properly prosecute the gang-stalking campaign against the targeted person. Go back into my some of my earlier videos, the ones that I've done in the past month and a half, 2 months, where I talk about weapons technology and gang-stalking campaigns, and you will get a more in-depth discourse as to what kinds of technologies go into gang-stalking campaigns. And mind you, all a gang-stalking campaign is a revenue generator for the military-industrial complex, because the federal government has to purchase this military-grade technology in order to use it on private citizens for behavior modification and for human experimentation and for social engineering and all of the various things that gang-stalking uses as its auspices for existing. Okay. Ultimately, the political system in the United States, the legislative process, is aimed at securing contracts for various industries, okay, namely the ones that get the biggest government contracts, okay, the telecom industry, the construction industry, the military industrial complex, okay. These types of industries have the most to gain with respect to going in and getting government contracts to offer the government products and services, because the federal government purchases products and services from private businesses to the tune of $2 trillion a year, give or take. So if you have a product or service, or if you have a company and you can offer a service to the United States federal government, and you find a way to pitch those services to the right auxiliary, okay, some companies use lobbyists to talk to congressional representatives and essentially pitch products and services through those lobbyists to congressional representatives, so they can try and get a purchase of these products and services put into the next congressional bill that goes up for ratification. So to make a long story short there, you can make a pretty penny if you are a company or business who gets the opportunity to do business with the United States federal government, because they will buy from you, and they will buy a lot from you if you have something to offer them of value, etc., etc., etc. And if a congressional representative helps you secure a contract with the federal government for your business, chances are you will show that congressional representative your gratitude by offering them big donations in their next election campaign. And the cycle continues. Businesses use lobbyists to pitch products to congressional representatives. If the congressional representative can approve those products and services in the next budget, your company gets paid for the work, the products and services that it offers, and in return, you can make big donations from the proceeds that you earn, the profits that you earn, back to the congressional representative next time they run for re-election. And the cycle goes on and on and on. Now, gang-stalking uses quite a bit of military-grade industrial technology to function. So what that says to me is that the United States federal government is purchasing products and services in bulk that will assist the national security apparatus in this country and the intelligence community in prosecuting gang-stalking campaigns. If you were to repeal gang-stalking tonight, let's say the Congress realizes how sinister and deleterious it is to society, and they unanimously vote to end all operations tonight. Trillions of dollars in military industrial grade technology are now left on the table. Because without gang stalking, okay, the national security apparatus in this country doesn't need to purchase the kinds of weapons technology that it takes to prosecute a gang stalking campaign. So the companies that produce things like Stingray devices and ultra low frequency weapons and Vercator technology, gyrotron technology, smart dust technology, hydrogel technology, electromagnetic technology, laser sound boom technology, hidden camera technology, okay, data interception technology, GPS tracking technology, all the various technologies that it takes to prosecute a gang stalking campaign against a person are no longer needed if gang stalking does not exist. That means that the companies that produce these weapons, these various technologies, are gonna miss out on all of the profits that they are presently making off of the U.S. federal government for the purchase of these weapons to prosecute gang-stalking campaigns. So the very practice and methodology of gang-stalking generates untold trillions of dollars per year for the military-industrial complex, who sells the weapons needed for gang-stalking campaign to the U.S. federal government, who basically assigns them to the national security apparatus and the military-industrial, or rather the national intelligence apparatus that essentially prosecutes gang-stalking campaigns. Okay, so in other words, a lot of money gets left on the table if gang-stalking ends tonight. So that's why there isn't more attention given to this social problem, which I call the quintessential political problem of the 21st century, because it essentially nullifies America's claim as a democracy and a constitutional republic. Because the people didn't get to vote on gang stalking's existence, and quite a bit of what happens in gang stalking, particularly the more thuggish elements of it, trample the constitutional rights of the targeted persons who are placed in gang stalking campaigns extrajudicially. But rather we hear stories in the news like, for example, what's going on with Jeffrey Epstein? Right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you over the next 5 minutes what's going on with Jeffrey Epstein. This is a story that has dominated news headlines over the past year, as if it's ultra consequential to the United States trajectory through time and space. Okay? Jeffrey Epstein was a billionaire financier who did some business with President Donald J. Trump and a lot of other real estate giants and venture capitalists in the Manhattan area, which is a very upscale, very wealthy area. Jeffrey Epstein loaned these various tycoons money, and these tycoons paid him back at interest. Paid him back with interest. If you were somebody in need of venture capital, you could go to Jeffrey Epstein if your idea was good enough, if it was profitable enough, if it was feasible enough. He'd give you some money to get that business off the ground, and he'd expect a return on his money with interest, kind of like a bank. And where did Jeffrey Epstein get his money to loan out to various business persons looking for cash? He'd get it from a bank, and he'd pay the bank back. And he got to keep the leftovers for himself, and he became a billionaire rather quickly. Jeffrey Epstein, like a lot of very wealthy men, engaged in some philandering. It got to the point where he wanted to meet women so bad that he hired a woman named Ghislaine Maxwell and paid her a salary of $100,000 a year to do nothing but patrol New York City and look for women who were willing to sleep with the guy. That's all she did. That was her whole career. That was her whole job. That was everything to her with respect to her income. She was paid 6 figures by a tycoon financier to find women for the man to carouse with. And there was no limit to the number of women that she would go out and find for this man. Whenever he wanted to meet a new woman, he'd call Ghislaine up. She'd hop in her Mercedes Benz. She'd patrol Manhattan, New York City, Central Park, probably the 5 boroughs as well, looking for women for this man to carouse with. And he steadily paid her 6-figure salary every year just to do that service for him. She'd go up to women, meet them, talk to them, say, I have a guy that'd like to meet you. He's very wealthy. I think you'd enjoy his company. He has an apartment in Manhattan, and he'd like to take you out to dinner, etc., etc. Most women, particularly those living in the Big Apple, didn't turn that offer down. And they set it up to meet with Jeffrey. He'd wine and dine them. Eventually he'd carouse with them. And then they'd go on their merry way. And he'd ask Ghislaine Maxwell to go out and find some more women from him probably a week later. That's all that arrangement was. Now, it was obvious over time that Miss Maxwell did this service for other tycoons as well. They would pay her a set amount every year to go out and find women to help them to help them get their philandering desires taken care of. One of these men was allegedly our president, but the files that are kept on this matter are sealed at this point, and all we have is speculation. But it appears that over time, this woman, Ghislaine Maxwell, who she grew up wealthy but became estranged from her family, so she had to do things like this for money. She was going out and finding underage girls for Jeffrey Epstein, and eventually the entire arrangement got sniffed out by federal law enforcement auxiliaries, and they decided to prosecute the both of them for a number of sex crimes, including human trafficking, if I'm not mistaken. And they both ended up getting something like 30 years in prison. Jeffrey Epstein apparently committed suicide in his cell, although there are some sources that say he bought his way out of prison, got plastic surgery to make himself look like an Oriental person, and he moved to Asia somewhere. And Ghislaine Maxwell, on the other hand, is still in prison to the present day. That's it. I just summed up for you the news story of the year in less than 10 minutes. But we've had to listen to this debacle for the past year at the expense of more important news. If gang-stalking, the monumental national security disaster and total act of human degeneracy, had gotten the attention in the news media that the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell story has gotten, I can promise you this country would already be a better place. National security is important. Covert operations are important. Various innovative law enforcement techniques are important. To ensure the safety and sovereignty of the United States. If these various military, law enforcement, and semi-law enforcement protocols are used as weapons against citizens, obviously to their detriment, but to the benefit of other citizens, that becomes a crime against humanity, a financial crime, a crime of corruption, and a federal hate crime. Or we'll call it a state-sanctioned hate crime. There is already in place, really before gang-stalking was ever exposed by myself and others, an effort to hide the violence and the disruptiveness of gang-stalking. One of those accountability dodging tactics is, well, we'll find some psychologists and some psychiatrists that know a lot about the human mind, that know a lot about the human brain, that know a lot about human behavior. Okay, people in the psychiatric industry or the psychological industry that are accredited by various boards and so forth, who have credentials as far as the eye can see, who have probably written books and articles and peer-reviewed journals and so forth, will have them say, and this is the federal establishment, the national security apparatus, because they want to keep gang-stalking going as long as possible, because it gives them the opportunity to exercise absolute power over people with no recourse. Okay, and the gang stalkers are the useful idiots that take the signals from the liaisons and perpetrate the disruption tactics against the targeted persons. They want to keep this going as long as possible, so in order to divert attention away from the remedy, or rather the problem and the remedy, they'll find reputed members of the psychiatric or the psychological community to say, you know what, there is no gang stalking. These people are absolute barking mad. Okay, they're batshit crazy. And you know what? We are going to show you studies. We are going to show you journals. We are going to show you articles. We are going to show you academic materials that proves that these people claiming to be targeted persons are out of their minds, and they are quite frankly, imagining all this because they're either narcissistic, delusional, or there's something else to be gained there by claiming to be a targeted person. So you have the sabotage of the credibility of the targeted person by questioning their sanity. Then you have the patriot action, where people who don't like being called out on this signaling mechanism will jump into the fray and go, these targeted persons, particularly the ones that are vocal like Smith is, are just unpatriotic people. They're just simply people who hate America anyway. These are the kind of people that just need to leave the country, because this country is the way it is, and we think there's enough people in this country who like the country the way it is to where we don't need an investigation into gang-stalking. Tell them to go get a job or something. Not an education. They're not saying go get an education. They're saying go to another country or go get a job. Too bad workplace mobbing makes that rather difficult for a targeted person. See my previous discourse on workplace mobbing for more on that. Our country is $32 trillion in debt, which may or may not be a bad thing, because in these times, the Federal Reserve has less of a capacity to induce boom and bust cycles in the American economy due to its debt as it did in past decades. It used to be so that a boom was created when the Federal Reserve offered easy loans to governments and businesses at cheap rates, so that these government auxiliaries and these businesses, namely these banks, were able to offer free and easy and cheap money to the general public in the way of mortgages and car loans, with a lot of these loans going to people who could not realistically pay them back. And that created a boom. There were lots of people buying houses. There were lots of people buying cars. There were lots of people who were able to take advantage of a lot of the easy and cheap money that banks were offering, courtesy of the Federal Reserve, because remember, the Federal Reserve loans money to banks and governments. And then banks and governments are able to turn around and loan that money to the people at interest rates that are reflective of the interest rates that the Federal Reserve gave to the governments and businesses in the first place. So if the Federal Reserve offers loans to governments and businesses, and mind you, not just the federal government, but state governments can take out Federal Reserve loans as well. If the Federal Reserve makes credit difficult to get and makes it expensive with respect to its interest rates, then governments and banks are tight with their credit, and they're tight with the credit that they issue out, meaning it's tougher to get credit, and then the interest rates are higher, which makes the money more expensive. However, if the Federal Reserve decides to offer easy credit with low interest rates to governments and banks, then those governments and banks can turn around and offer easy and low interest rates to the general public to take advantage of various products and services that require loans in order to secure them. So, in the past, the Federal Reserve could create a boom cycle by offering cheap, easy credit to governments and banks. Then the governments and banks would offer cheap and easy credit to the American people, even those who could not realistically pay it back. And that created quite a bit of, it created a boom, meaning the economy was booming. There were lots of goods and services being purchased, but there was a lot of long-term debt that was also created. And if the Federal Reserve years later decided to tighten credit and make it more expensive with respect to the interest rate, then governments and banks passed those costs down to the consumer and made credit tougher to get and more expensive. That created a bust cycle. And a lot of property, including homes and cars and businesses and so forth, were confiscated by governments and banks because the owners of these various pieces of property were no longer able to pay the loans, or excuse me, the monthly payments on these items any further because of how difficult and how expensive credit had become. So that basically gave the Federal Reserve System unhealthy levels of control over the American economy. And it has less of an inclination to induce boom and bust cycles nowadays because, quite frankly, it was determined that those were acts of corporate malfeasance, and we don't see it as much in these days as we did over the past maybe 60 years. So the economy of the United States is still a consumer-based economy. The buyer's habits still determine the trajectory of the markets. The means of production and the success of various enterprises depends on consumer behavior. Now, gang-stalking is planted firmly in the center of the economic discussion. Both my significant other, Lori, and myself, over the years have seen significant changes in consumer behavior in our respective generation because of government spending. A lot of it is very wasteful. That was one of the things about Senator John McCain that I thought was interesting. He talked a lot about these inserts called earmarks and pork barrel projects that got tacked onto congressional bills that called for spending on various items and projects at the expense of the taxpayer that, quite frankly, weren't needed. And he brought a lot of attention to government waste in that regard, particularly in his 2008 presidential campaign. Now, gang-stalking is firmly in the center of the economic discussion. It's firmly in the center of the sociological discussion. It's firmly in the center of the ethical discussion. It's firmly in the center of the religious or theological discussion. It's firmly in the center of the military-industrial discussion. It's firmly in the center of the congressional and legislative discussion. It's firmly in the center of the executive and judicial discussions with respect to the executive and judicial branches of government. Because remember, you have three branches of government. You have the legislative, which includes the Congress. You have the executive, which includes the office of the president. And you have the judicial, which is essentially the Supreme Court and all the courts. To sum it up briefly, gang stalking encompasses all of these things. Gang stalking is at the core of all of these things. How is it at the core of all of these things? Because it was brought into existence through the legislative mechanism, namely post 9/11 national security measures. It was implemented extrajudicially, meaning that no judge, jury, or court had any hand in its operation. It's at the center of the presidential power discussion because no president was able to sit down and deliberate its effectiveness with respect to how well it represents American values and how it benefits society and so forth, because no president ever saw it. They simply signed off on the national security bills that it was contained in and implemented this program without knowing that they implemented this program because it was buried in 10,000-page national security bills. It has the ability to alter social mechanisms with its signaling mechanisms and workplace mobbing mechanisms. It has the ability to affect the economy because there are businesses that have employees that utilize this thing either to the detriment of the economy or to the success of the economy. It's hard to say, but it affects the economy one way or the other. It affects the judiciary. Yes, there are courtrooms that allow these signaling mechanisms in them. Either to the success of the proceedings or the detriment of the proceedings, it's hard to say. But I've experienced synchronization inside of every court building I've ever, every judicial establishment I've ever been in. It certainly affects the news and entertainment industries because we have not heard anything out of these industries concerning gang stalking at all up to this point. And I've explained in some of my previous discourses why, but I'll reiterate. It's because a news journalist cannot pick up a story either in a newspaper or on television unless the producers of that paper, that newspaper or that television gives it the green light. Okay? There's a reason that there are no gang stalking cover stories on Time magazine, The Economist, Forbes, okay, or in major newspapers like the Denver Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, the LA Times. It's because the editors-in-chief of these newspapers have not been given the green light by whatever the governmental entities are that, we'll say, semi-impose news stories on the newspaper. Newspapers don't really get into independent reporting anymore. They wait on stories to come through and are essentially approved by the national security apparatus in this country at this point. It's not like it was in years past where newspapers and magazines and cable news stations picked up stories that they thought the public would consume, stories that engaged the public, that fascinated people. They would much rather these days, probably by mandate, if you want to know the truth, have to get approval from the national security apparatus to produce certain news stories. You see, the national security apparatus manually tells, or rather mandates, to magazines, newspapers, cable news, and local news what stories they can and can't produce, what journalistic endeavors that they can pursue and which ones they can't pursue. Okay, the newspapers, the general news media in this country, and the general magazine production mechanism in this country is answerable to the national security apparatus in this country. And the national security apparatus in this country gets to decide what news stories get published in these various mediums and what news stories do not get published in these various mediums. It is the national security apparatus, ladies and gentlemen. And because gang stalking is a national security product that has a deleterious function and operates as a crime against humanity, of course the national security apparatus doesn't want newspapers, magazines, and cable news or local news reporting on it. So the national security apparatus has manually blocked all discussions of gang stalking from the American mass communications mechanism. Okay, because the national security apparatus in this country knows that the minute gang stalking and its auspices hit the American news media and all of these in-depth investigations start happening with respect to its auspices, the program would be quickly deemed as un-American and anti-civilization, and would thus cease to be. We live in a national security state. I think post 9/11, a lot of Americans were willing to give up certain freedoms in exchange for the protections that the national security apparatus in this country could offer them. But it's gotten to the point now where those pulling the strings in the national security apparatus are more worried about the kickbacks they can receive from securing government contracts, or producing government contracts for this company or that, and the political benefits that the legislative representatives will reap by continuing to authorize financing for these national security products at the expense of every targeted person in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, in the course of human events, the United States federal government has authorized state-sanctioned thuggery in the form of clandestine gang stalking. That is my State of the Union, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in.